Right. Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Renaissance and Early Modern Seminar in Visual and Material Culture, which is organized by myself and my colleague, Deborah Crone. And welcome to those who are watching virtually on our live stream. There will be an opportunity at the end, should you wish to tweet in questions, by following our hashtag, which is on the screen, hashtag at Bard Graduate Center TV. That said, it's a tremendous pleasure this evening to welcome Shira Brisman, who's braved the winter storms to come from Wisconsin-Madison to be with us tonight. She's an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches Northern European art of the early modern period. She received her PhD from Yale in 2012 with a dissertation on the topic of Briefkultur, art and the epistolary mode of address in the age of Albrecht Dürer. She subsequently taught for 2 years at Columbia University as an Andrew W. Mellon lecturer and postdoctoral fellow, and she's received numerous prestigious grants. Her research has been supported by the Albrecht Dürer Fellowship at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg, the Samuel Kress Foundation, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and the American Center for Learned Societies. She currently has two book projects in the works. The first, Albrecht Dürer and the Epistolary Mode of Address, about which we're going to hear more, or an aspect of tonight. And the second book is called Contriving Balance, a historical portrait of the concept of symmetry in the early modern period. And as a little puff, next Friday she's returning to New York to host a panel she's organized at the CAA conference entitled The Double-Sided Object in the Renaissance. Dr. Brisman's talk is entitled Relay and Delay, Triumphal Processions in the Era of the Post. Welcome, Shira.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I know this is a sad day for some of us who work in European art, and so I'm really particularly glad to see such an audience and so many friends among the audience. It's also really wonderful for me to be in this room because I have been enjoying the programming that has been happening here for years now. That is to say, I myself have learned so much in this room, so it's really an honor to be presenting my research to you in this room today. My talk today comes from the book project that Andrew mentioned, Albrecht Dürer and the Epistolary Mode of Address. And this book brings together, it takes a look at letter writing culture in the early modern period, the ways in which messages sent, the way that they traveled, and the patterns of receipt, delay, interception, and sending. And provides us as a context for considering the work of Albrecht Dürer, Germany's foremost printmaker at the time, and asks the question of how we can use this context to reflect on Dürer's mode of address, the way he's thinking about audience and receipt. So that project is divided into 3 parts, writing, sending, and receiving. And my talk today comes from that middle part, sending, which is dedicated to the theme of transit, and you'll hear more about that. The cover of a notebook that records Abby Warburg's correspondence with his friend Andre Yalis bears a reproduction of a maiden in a fluttering gown who balances a basket of fruit on her head. To Warburg, this figure, cropped from a photograph of a fresco by Domenico Ghirlandaio, embodied movement and represented the visitation of antiquity in the Renaissance's representational world. Throughout his published writings, lectures, and informal notes, Warburg would trace this nympha to a variety of classical ancestors, such as Fortuna and Victory. Pasted on the exterior of the volume, she faces its binding, running counter to the direction of text. It is from left to right that Warburg wrote, that pages turn, and that his reader's eyes move in an effort to grasp this figure, whose historical meaning Warburg admits he arrived at through sedentary erudition. which is one of my favorite activities. Printed images from the early modern period are often described in terms of their mobility, which refers to the geographical breadth reached by different impressions, the phased stages of ownership, and the improvisational behaviors of recipients who colored, cut, pasted, or wrote upon the pages. This evening, I would like to propose 2 additional ways in which the term mobility might be attached to prints. The first concerns how images in this medium depict movement, lending valence to left and right as from and toward, while implying a progression across a horizontal plane. A second reapplication of the term mobility considers how such images activate the mind of the viewer, stirring the imagination to move from the literal to the figurative realm, from the conceit of representation, this is what is happening in the image, to interpretation. This is where the image might permit me to go. To identify the pictorial triggers that give way to such thought is to attend to the vehicular quality of images, which transport the viewer to a temporal moment that is not the same as the one the scene initially stages. Comparisons to another mobile medium, that of the written letter, which shares with the printed image its patterns of terrestrial crossings, serve to structure the relationship between these 2 considerations, the representation of movement within the picture's frame and the cognitive movement away from it. The correspondence between Warburg and Jolles introduces the theme of depicted and figurative mobilities. Jolles describes to his friend that he has fallen in love with Ghirlandaio's figure. Where does she come from, he asks. But rather than answer the question within the time frame of Ghirlandaio's narrative and provide an immediate prologue to her rival in the bedchamber, Jolles stretches the question back, casting open the boundaries of the fresco's setting. He uses the occasion of the nympha's arrival to ask a historical question about the origins of her motion in Greek, Asian, Egyptian, or Mesopotamian ancestry. In his response, Warburg describes 2 possible absorptions with the picture in terms of alternative directions, horizontal or vertical movement. Warburg associates vertical motion with the circling flight of ideas, which he contrasts with the latitudinal project of historical research. I am not equipped for this kind of upward locomotion, he admits. It is given to me only to look back. Even in pronouncing his limitations, Warburg proves the capability of his imagination, as both aesthetic rapture and the pursuit of origins are transportations away from the conceits of Ghirlandaio's picture. Neither Jolles nor Warburg is pursuing the kitchen or marketplace that provided the fruits the nympha balances on her head. In asking, where does she come from, Jolles permits Warburg to answer the question, where does she take me? The correspondence between Warburg and Jolles was fictive, that is, contrived in the epistolary mode for the sake of the discursive, and unfinished, that is, intended toward an unrealized publication. 2 traits it shares with the subject of my talk, the Triumphal Procession. This title refers to an uncompleted project commissioned by Maximilian to depict the movement of a cortege that never existed. The Triumphal Procession belongs to the elaborate productions designed by a sovereign whose ambitions were both propagandistic and commemorative. In 1512, Maximilian dictated to his secretary, Marx Treitzaurwein, his vision of an imaginary parade of riders, banners, floats, and carriages that transport representations of his lineage and military victories. This textual description generated several collaborative visual incarnations. Between 1512 and 1515, Albrecht Altorfer and his Regensburg workshop painted miniatures on 109 sheets of parchment. In 1516, Hans Bergmeier, in collaboration with other artists, began the designs for a sequence of woodcuts. By the time of Maximilian's death in 1519, 137 designs had been executed. The rest were never completed. 2 of the cut blocks portray the float dedicated to Maximilian's wedding to Mary of Burgundy, a design by Dürer known as the Small Triumphal Chariot. In a pen drawing pertaining to a different part of the procession, the chariot in which the emperor sits with his royal family, Dürer quickens the quadriga with a whip-wielding verve. Isolating this portion of the procession as an independent unit, Pirkheimer choreographed an allegory that Dürer illustrated, in which the figure of Ratio commands the reins, while 20 other virtues dance alongside the horses and chariot in a ring above the emperor's head. Maximilian received Dürer's pen and watercolor composition by post in March of 1518. In 1521 or 22, Dürer oversaw the painting of a fresco based on the allegorical design of the imperial chariot on the north wall of the reception chamber in the Nuremberg Rathaus. Here, I've highlighted that for you. It was destroyed in 1945. A record of its placement survives in a painting from the 17th century and in several reproductive prints. In 1522, Dürer, whose plans to translate the watercolor composition into woodcut had been interrupted by the emperor's death, published the 8-block print at his own expense. It is known today as the Great Triumphal Chariot. So in these various incarnations, some survive only in replicas or as fragments, and others were never completed. The Triumphal Procession does not conform to a concept of a work of art that is defined as a single object made by an individual creator and completed on a certain date. Maximilian's scripted program spawned several pictorializations that were joint efforts between humanist authors, administrators, and groups of artists, and some of these were finished only after the emperor's death, or were never finished at all. Dürer's Small Chariot and Great Chariot offer particularly rich investigations of tonight's themes, depicted motion and imaginary digression. Their analyses here are structured around excerpts from the letters of Maximilian that pertain to the procession, issued by a ruler who embodied mobility in a different way from Ghirlandaio's Nympha, by traveling between regions of his empire and maintaining contact with its courts. The letters document pieces of administrative business far from the dramatic rhetoric of Warburg and his friend. Read alongside the pictorial projects they describe, which represent forward motion across a horizontal plane, the letters lend information about the transmission of artistic designs through the post and the speed of production. These epistolary communications offer language that describes how these images in motion functioned and the effects of their abandoned, lost, or transformed states. Maximilian's movement between regions necessitated a systematized tracking of the correspondences between collaborators. Johannes Stabius and Marx Treitzauerein in Vienna assisted the emperor in developing the text. The pictorial designs were divided between Hans Birkmeyer and Leonhard Beck in Augsburg, under the supervision of Konrad Peutinger, Albrecht Altorfer in Regensburg, and Dürer and Hans Springenklee in Nuremberg. At least 17 different cutters were involved. Ordering the transmission of text, blocks, and proofs through the post, Maximilian guides his addressees in maintaining security. He writes to Peutinger that he has instructed Stabius to send him an edition of the Triumphal Procession, and that upon receipt, Peutinger is to send it to Maximilian by post, wrapping it in a thick cloth to protect it from rain. This letter gives advice for how a suite illustrating transportation is to be transported, embedding the artistic imagery of the emperor's fantastical procession within the practical concerns about postage. The letters intend to protect the designs from interception by recipients outside of the collaborative team. On August 1st, 1513, Maximilian writes to his treasury secretary in Innsbruck, Hans Front, that Treitzauerein will be sending him a book of the Triumphal Procession. As soon as he receives it, Front is to send it to the emperor, quote, securely by post, and arrange that it is delivered to us and to no one else. Unauthorized circulation warranted diplomatic intervention. In a letter to Melchior Fitzing at the court in Vienna, dated July 27, 1518, the Nuremberg Council reports that a traveler appearing at a church dedication publicly sold printed pictures belonging to His Majesty's triumph, which the offender claimed to have purchased from a scribe at a pig's market. So concerned are Nuremberg council members about the affair that they have sent this dispatch through a private envoy rather than one of the city's sworn messengers. The integrity of Maximilian's program relied upon an efficient relay between numerous people and upon the controlled dissemination of the prints. While the advisors, designers, and woodcutters were geographically dispersed, the pictorial conceit of the multi-block procession demands a uniformity of action. A griffin-mounted herald announces the forward motion, which unfolds across the sequence of pages and culminates in baggage carriers who heave parcels and box-laden carts. The coherence of the procession relies on a standard sense of figural scale and a smooth cadence to the advance. In the final scene of the procession, the established pattern of limited ground and blank sky breaks for a fully realized landscape. So commencing with a fantastical creature and punctuating with a worldly setting, movement proceeds in the triumphal procession, not only in the left to right stampede, but also in the transitioning of pictorial modes from the mythical to the local. The griffin is a bird of ancient origin. The trees, mountains, and steeples have an unmistakably Danubian character. These two forms of pictorial origins that bracket the procession as a whole, the creature with classical roots and the Germanic landscape, also combine in the pair of woodcuts that Dürer designed, which represent the emperor's wedding. Two figures are responsible for the movement in this portion of the parade. A winged female figure in the driver's seat controls the horses by a taut halter, while a mercenary soldier pushes the cart from behind. These motion setters have different origins. One is a classically derived personification of victory, the other a member of the emperor's army. The identity of the charioteer and the relegation of her assistant to the rear seem to have been Dürer's interpolations. Maximilian's textual outline for this section, his marriage to the Mary of Burgundy, concisely states that 2 men on horseback shall bear the emperor's wedding. In the miniatures designed by Aldorfer, this sheet depicts 2 mounted members of court holding poles that support a tapestry where the union of the emperor and his bride is shown. In the context of the collaborative woodcut sequence, Dürer's selection of an allegorical figure to steer the steeds sets his image apart from the rest of the procession. Nowhere else is a personification responsible for the equestrian charge. In predicatively linking the allegorical charioteer to the representation of battles that succeed this print, Dürer draws upon antiquity's association between victory and triumphal parade. A commemorative coin might dedicate one side to the winged figure, indicating through the dialectics of front to back the eternal reign of the hero. Another motif favors a triumphant ruler conducting the cavalry from a cart on which winged victory is represented ornamentally, as in a medal commemorating the triumph of Germanicus and a silver cup exalting Tiberius. And you can see victory here. Both of these examples position the allegory to decorate rather than drive. But rather than embed victory within the figurative imagery of the chariot, Dürer gives her the reins. Allegory charges the image, associating this portion of Maximilian's biography, his first marriage, with an achievement that transcends a particular moment by virtue of its durational impact. The placement of winged victory as the propeller of motion predicts the loosening of Dürer's great chariot from association with a terrestrial parade. This later sequence achieves a wholly symbolic order where the emperor's movement is one of apotheosis. Already while conceiving of the small chariot for inclusion within the triumphal procession at large, Dürer was operating in a different spatio-temporal condition from the artists who designed the surrounding scenes. At the same time that he was setting the fictive parade in the present with the local gesture of the mercenary, he was also setting it at a distance with a reference to antiquity, and in the distance by alluding to the emperor's transcendence to another realm. In the juxtaposition of the 2 propellers, one regional and the other remote, Dürer reveals his inclinations towards a pictorial balance of something that reads as near and something that reads as far. Dürer's victory and his slit-sleeved mercenary not only operate in separate symbolic modes from one another, they also move with different momenta. 4 horses vigorously announce the canopied float. By force of their kinetic advance, the horses and their charioteer bend toward each other. They toss back as she leans in. The soldier bends his knees and pushes the wagon forward, a posture familiar to any modern viewer who has tried to dislodge a stalled automobile, something one does a lot in Madison, Wisconsin. A hind accelerator was not an anomaly in the history of triumphal processions. In the Tiberius Bowl, for example, soldiers bring up the rear. In Durer's Small Chariot, the combination of victory and the contemporary military servant inflects the marriage cart with a predicative foreshadowing of the battle scenes immediately to come, connecting the wedding between the Habsburgs and the Burgundian court to the conquests provoked by their union. Being responsible for motion has its symbolic place. Maximilian employed mercenaries to move his program forward and to conquer new ground. If victory stands apart from the other agents of motion in the procession, Durer's soldier finds company with the mercenaries in the scenes that immediately follow. The text prescribes that a few Landesknechte shall carry some castles and towns in the ancient Roman style. The Altdorfer miniatures depict the battles within processional standards, hoisted on poles carried by marchers on foot. This mode of two-dimensional representation is shared by the banner bearers of the 1504 Triumph, the 1504 Triumph of Caesar by Jacob of Strasbourg after Benedetto Bordone, and in Andrea Mantegna's depiction of the same subject, which was painted for the Gonzaga and popularized in print by Andrea Andreani. But Hans Springenklee, often named as the designer of Maximilian's processed battles, opts for more complex locomotive structures. Motion is not implemented by equestrian force, but rather by rotational physics. Gears interlock with coils, and mercenaries prod at ratchets with spinning poles. They churn pegged gyres and spin cranks which set gears into cycle. The floats are built of parts evocative of the shipping industry, a connection made especially evident in the scene depicting the battle against the Venetians. The wagons representing Maximilian's battles demonstrate the Habsburgs' possession of the means by which to engineer warfare. They also evoke a classical association between triumphal processions and nautical arrival. The parade float's origins lie in Bacchus's carriage overseas by a wheeled ship, which gave way to his celebratory debarkation on land. Antique myth associates transport across bodies of water with shifts in cultural alliances and the instantiation of origins. Europa's abduction by Zeus and her landing on Crete found a continent. Bacchus's sweeping away of Ariadne establishes the constellation Corona. Processional wagons carry pagan associations with aquatic passage and arrivals that cause cultural or cosmic shifts. The explicitness of the mechanics adds symbolic layers. The wheel is comprised of core and peripheries, a shape that a ruler trying to hold fast to political centralization would want to evoke. It is the property of Fortuna, who has the power to spin favorable outcomes. In a print personifying her, Heinrich Aldegraver places her wheel inside a sail, compounding the metaphor of fortune's turns with that of life's adventures as the journey of a ship. In Hans Sebald Bam's twist, the goddess of fate balances a mercenary atop her spindle. In one of the blocks of the triumphal procession, a large wheel constitutes one of the parade devices. One soldier cranks its central spindle, while 4 others spur the rotation by climbing the slats inside. Here, the means of movement meets the metaphor associated with favorable outcomes. The triumphal procession involves 2 levels of fiction. One is that a pageant is taking place, with horses, riders, and marchers parading forth. The other involves the stories unfolding within the built devices that these revelers bear. In his conception for the chariot representing the emperor's wedding, Durer connects the 2 figures responsible for motion by placing a laurel wreath in Victory's hand and another around the head of the cart-pushing mercenary. These figures belong to the same narrative register. Both are participants in the ceremony, while the other figures, the three maidens on the platform, the four-winged cherubs atop the columns, and the emperor and his bride who flank the heraldic shield, are part of the furniture of the display. By breaking with the convention of having male members of Maximilian's court serve as the active agents in the cavalcade, Durer establishes the possibility of a slippage between the allegorical figures and the celebrants in the pageant. He invites the mind to lose track of the distinction between the event of the procession and the many actions and motions taking place within the made worlds that are being pulled along. In the parade floats, ornament becomes pageant. Triumphal processions permit the dioramic figurines and the participating agents to exchange qualities of stasis and mobility. In Montaigne's Triumph of Caesar, the enthroned victor possesses a monumentality that is echoed by the enthroned god represented below on the placard that adorns his chariot's wheel. So you see, here's the emperor, and here's this figure below. It is as if in his crowning he has become statuesque. Conversely, in a print by Jacob of Strasbourg representing the same moment, Caesar rides upon a wagon whose side displays a carving of Neptune. The tailed monster holds the handles of the brackets fitted around the equine torsos. If one had to attribute the motion, one would have to confess that the horses are initiating their own march. But the print engages the notion that the mythical creature on the side of the wagon sets the pace of the steeds. An engraving depicting the procession of Bacchus and Ariadne celebrates the playful illogic that negates the distinction between the activity of agents and the elements of design. The vines that constitute the walls of the lover's chariot, I've highlighted them here, continue in an awning over their heads, then slip around the trunk of a tree. The materials of the wagon do not have limits. Rather, the couple's bower is made up of the same sprouts as the canopies that syncopate the scene in a decorative pattern. Both in establishing order and in permitting whimsy, processions use boundaries of construction to reset frames of mind. The depicted narratives within the triumphal procession allow the viewer to follow different kinds of motion, not just the forward propulsion of the moving cavalcade. In the Venetian scene, a densely packed combat is taking place on the side of the wagon. Warriors trample the fallen underfoot. Collapsed bodies also pile on top of this structure. Next to the seated personification of the city and the winged lion are supine soldiers, one of whose legs dangles off the side of the cart. The overall effect is a kind of spilling over, a transgression of the figures from the boundary of the framing device on the sides of the wagon to the three-dimensional realm up on top. Upon another processional float belonging to this group, a team of soldiers advances toward a fortified city. Two have pitched their ladder against the enemy's wall, while one climbs to the top, raising the Burgundian flag. To follow the upward movement of these figures is to be detained from watching the passage of the parade by engaging in the stories within. This is an art responsive to the literary mode of ekphrasis. Part of the imaginary work of this ancient rhetoric lies in the speaker's capacity to become caught up in the narrative, so that he begins to animate the scene he beholds, describing the movements of figures who are in fact frozen in painted or carved poses. The poet may even construe events that are not actually depicted, but that are extensions of what is represented within the pictorial field. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, Keats's absorption in the scene of a crowd coming to a sacrifice, which is rendered on the side of a piece of pottery, goads his mind to think of the place abandoned by the gathered lot. What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? The depicted motion of the marble men and maidens overwrought activates his mind to move beyond the represented space to envision the silent streets the celebrants have left behind. The implication of movement around the girth of the vessel transports the poet's mind from the object to the realm of the imaginary. Prince played well the role of responding to a form of poetry that was itself responsive to images. Through the correspondences between text and illustration elicited by book production, a sequence of images might be charged with the representation of an often imaginary work of art described in the literature. This circumstance fits the woodcuts that illustrate one of the most renowned examples of early printing, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, an epic romance lyric first issued in 1499. On the way to their betrothal, Polyphilus and Polia observe a sequence of 6 triumphal processions that celebrate their union. The text lends a lengthy description, 63 pages long, to the images on the chariot's sides. The chronicling of the narratives is so rich in detail that the book's illustrator does not attempt to contain the stories within the vessels, which are left blank. Instead, the woodcuts render the tales of the lovers in successive rectangular frames. Disengaged from the shapes that contain them, the woodcuts enable the reader to enter the narratives within the narrative and to experience the scenes, the rape of Europa, Leda and the Swan, Jupiter and Semele, Vertumnus and Pomona, as freshly delivered tales, momentarily suspending the book's nested frames. These are myths depicted on mobile furniture, seen by a protagonist who is having a dream within a dream. In the woodcuts of Maximilian's Triumphal Procession, the vignettes on the sides of the carts permit the passage between different orders of representation. It may be that all of the winged figures holding wreaths on the pedestals are intended to be statues, that is, part of the built environment of the float, rather than costumed actors who participate in the parade, but the prints invite the blurring of boundaries between the two. Illuminators, through their choice of color, may adjudicate or equivocate. Durer's charioteer, who draws the wedding cart, seems to belong to both orders, thereby inviting the possibility of the reverse, that the other figural embodiments of abstract ideas might be animate beings rather than static forms. One of the 4 soldiers within the spinning wheel turns his head to look up at the allegory atop the float, where the seated king greets the personification of 2 different cities. This gaze reversal, an orientation backward as the motion of the procession persists forward, is echoed by the float within the wheel, with its Roman-inspired frieze of marching victors who process in the other direction. The movements of characters within the representational space on the sides of the float encourage the eye of the procession's onlooker to become wrapped in the inner narratives. The scenes on the processional carts invite connections to other episodes within the parade itself. On the side of one carriage, soldiers wrangle prisoners who are enclosed in a chain. This picture echoes the moment in the parade where the prisoners are herded by Maximilian's mercenaries in just this manner. The nested representations of processions within the procession speak to the emperor's numerous victories and monumentalize the action currently taking place as already belonging to historical record. The conceit of the imperial image elicits the passage between modes, from the representation of an event conceivably situated in the present to the depiction of a condition of transcendence beyond ordinary circumstances of time and place. The difference between these 2 pictorial states might also describe the relationship between Durer's small chariot and the great chariot. The former reasonably, if anonymously, participates in the sequence of woodcuts that constituted the completed portion of the triumphal procession at the emperor's death. The latter had its roots in this company as well. The great chariot was initially conceived as Maximilian's triumphal car, the segment of the procession where the emperor moves amidst his parading courtiers. In an early pen design by Dürer, the emperor is seated with his family in a carriage hauled by mounted riders. Dürer's instinct elicited an energetic quadriga. The speed of the horseman would find a feminized and classicizing expression in the draperies of the virtues and in Ratio's wind-swept locks. Pirkheimer developed a new program for the emperor's chariot, a freelance idea conveyed to the emperor through Fitzing, his contact in Nuremberg. In a letter sent from Augsburg on February 5, 1518, Maximilian responds enthusiastically to the promise of a conceptual departure from the earlier version. He asks Pirkheimer to send, with great diligence and speed, a colored sketch, eine Visierung, for the project. The letter does not contain Dürer's name. Rather, the emperor evokes the artist metonymically through his capacity to produce visualizations. The sketch substitutes for its creator in this correspondence, which connects intermediaries and surrogates. Imperial letters command action. When the sovereign sends instructions, he favors a closing phrase written in the imperative, "Do this according to our intention," which is interesting to think of next to Dürer's own personal letters to Pirkheimer, which end with "read this according to the sense." So each, Maximilian and Dürer each has his own way of ending a letter. "Do this according to our intention." This line enacts an epistolary command by referring back to the content of the letter. Maximilian includes an epistolary charge of this sort in a letter of 1512, asking the Nuremberg Council to release Dürer from the obligation of paying taxes in reward for his designs. He employs the refrain at the end of his directive to Peutinger, asking him to package the triumph to protect it from rain. He frequently uses the phrase at the close of missives to Stabius when the execution for the triumphal arch does not accord with the emperor's vision, or when Stabius has confused the program for the triumphal arch with that of the procession. And that happened a lot, which makes weeding through these sources very challenging. So the presence of the word Meinung in a letter gives way to further instances of making, as the intentions of the emperor drive the issuance of new drafts. Another type of imperial letter dramatizes the role of the creative agent. If German was the language for motivating production, Latin was the language for processing achievement. Maximilian's correspondence also follow this distinction. In a letter presenting the concept for the great chariot, which he calls Meine Inventio, Pirkheimer writes in German, but indicates that he has moved above and beyond the emperor's original idea with a mid-sentence switch to Latin that describes the deviation. Non solum triumphalis, sed etiam philosophica und moralis. With this lofty language, he presents his allegory, then returns to German to evoke the churning rhythm of his dedicated labor. Pirkheimer offers the emperor both the reason for the work's postponement, the ordering of the virtues required a long time, and proof of Dürer's diligence. Whereas Maximilian's February 5th letter does not name the person responsible for the Visierung, Pirkheimer insists on the direct involvement of Dürer and on the authenticity of his hand. The emperor's response to Pirkheimer's program for the Great Chariot survives in the form of two letters, both of which are dated March 29, 1518. The German letter misses the urging of Pirkheimer's presentational missive to acknowledge Dürer's contribution. Here, the word Meinung appears twice, where Maximilian declares his intention to employ Pirkheimer for another project. The other letter, bearing the same date and written in Latin, praises the triumphal chariot as Pirkheimer's invention and Dürer's design. An epistolary certificate, it was printed in a 1606 compilation of Pirkheimer's writings. The Latin letter formalizes the acceptance of the work, even though the version of it that the book reproduces, an engraved copy after Dürer's multi-block print, was one that the emperor never saw. The sketch of the chariot would reach the hands of the sovereign after some delay. The wagon bearing the emperor would not be printed as part of the woodcut sequence. Within the context of the incomplete triumphal procession, The apotheosis is an absence. The emperor never appears in the parade. His presence is made manifest only as part of the constructed world of the wagons, where he holds his shield with his bride atop the wedding cart and takes her hand in marriage within the tapestry on the side. The condition of the procession's incomplete state invigorates the effigy atop the small chariot, and other instances where Maximilian appears as a representation within the representation, with the role of embodying the sovereign. Within the first order of fiction, then, he appears redundantly and never in the flesh. Pirkheimer and Dürer eternally postpone the emperor's arrival by transporting his cavalcade into a fully allegorical realm. When it was printed in 1522, the Great Chariot proposed a different temporal circumstance from the other prints in the Triumphal Procession series. Here there are no mercenaries instigating the forward motion. The sense of motion is lent by the skirts of the virtues, which billow vigorously in the wind, and by the flowing hair of Ratio, the driver of the chariot. The 8 equestrian guides alternately raise and lower the wreaths they hold, stirring a rhythmic advance. The lunging frontal foot of each of these maidens indicates a lateral motion, while the swaying of the virtues atop the chariot evokes a circular dance. The garment of Fortitudo, whose back is turned, whips around in a semi-ellipse, indicating that the 4 who are united by interlinking wreaths are participating in a carousel. The sense that the emperor is being carried forth on solid ground and borne up into the immortalizing air is also lent by the 2 written descriptions of his bodily position. As the sun in the heavens, so is Caesar on earth. And the heart of the king is in the hand of God. One of these phrases relates the emperor's situation on earth in celestial terms, while the other locates a part of his body in the company of the divine. Together they create a chiastic description of his transition to an eternal beyond. Dürer's copyists have inflected renderings after this print with indications of ambivalence about whether the emperor's triumph is terrestrially situated. Karl Friedrich Schinkel's drawing eradicates the grass and rocks underfoot the virtues. He enhances the shadow cast by the wagon and the dancing maidens, placing a penumbral emphasis on the sculptural quality of the carriage plus accompaniment as whole. The monochromatic handling of the chariot and virtues against the blue paper unifies the figures with the vehicle's decorative elements. The frisking forms and ornamental motifs give an overall effect of something that is between fabricated and animate. The slippage between the built world of his carriage and the movement of beings indicate the emperor's passage. Thomas Schauerte describes the eagle on the rear wheel of Maximilian's cart as distinctive from the heraldic images of that type of bird inscribed upon the hubcaps. He has his wings half spread and seems ready at any moment to soar up from his perch on the wheel labeled Magnificentia. Within this decor, he clearly possesses a higher degree of reality, comparable to that of the horses, Schauerte writes. So this eagle, capable of the kind of living motion exhibited by the charioteer's equestrian engines, and thus not constricted to the realm of ornament, recalls the bird that flew from the funeral pyre of Pertinax, indicating, quote, the transitory moment between the end of worldly fame and the beginning of eternal fame. In the historiography of the work that Dürer executed for Maximilian's procession, scholars have alternatively tried to distinguish between the fictive and the real. Of the small chariot, Panofsky differentiated the pomegranates in the vase, which he calls edible fruit, from those supporting the columns, so sculpted orbs, and those depicted on the tapestry. This is a woven harvest. Rather than sort between artifice and actual, Schauerte blends, describing the bird on the great chariot's wheel as about to take flight. The shared resemblances between the built world and breathing beings invite the imagination's free passage. It is in the places where the fictive becomes real that the mind rises. This transitional mode is the expressive means that Dürer found to transport the emperor to everlasting majesty. Oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. The various versions of Maximilian's triumphs can be described in terms of fragmentation or delayed completion because of the modularity of prints. Planned as a succession of different blocks, certain arrangements within the larger program lend themselves to separation and autonomy. The Great Chariot becomes a distinct unit when Dürer obtains the privilege to print it as an allegorical triumph. Following its accompanying text across the 8 sheets from left to right, the reader ends at the beginning of the parade, where a colophon declares, "This wagon was devised, cut, and printed in Nuremberg by Albrecht Dürer in the year 1522. These words fix the image's production by giving the name of the artist, a location for the invention and production, and a date upon which it was finished." But the process of making and compiling prints have left in their artifacts other statements about agency, place, and time. A trial proof of the Great Chariot shows Victory holding a wreath above the emperor's head. In their isolation, the two figures lend the image the aerial quality of a mirage. This configuration calls attention to the detail of a carved face on the rear of the emperor's seat, whose gaze reversal seems symbolic of Maximilian's interest in the past. This turned face also resonates with the manner in which the need to contrive his posthumous image encroached upon the ruler with the urgency of Andrew Marvell's line. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And I know that line is about sex, and this is not about sex, but I just heard it when I saw this. So the trial proofs hold the moment of the emperor's transitional becoming by supporting him aloft, just as Victory is adding the laurels to his crown. The project of collecting also reveals temporal tears that speak to the conditions of producing multi-block prints. The British Museum possesses the lone example of a great chariot that was produced in 1559. The 4th sheet interrupts the catenation of later impressions with a survival from the first Latin release of 1523. This interpolation from an earlier time is evidence of what the compiler had at hand. The sequence is a relay of images that were produced through the volleying transmissions of letters that linked up inventors, designers, cutters, and the recipient, who assessed the timeliness of the image's arrival. Maximilian encouraged haste. Pirkheimer apologized for the delay. Dürer made ripe a commemorative opportunity, and a later editor judged an earlier piece a suitable substitute. The Triumphal Procession has remained incomplete. 6 drawings by Dürer of flag bearers were never cut as blocks and remain in the collection of the Albertina. Those designs that had been transferred to wood were printed and arranged in a sequence in 1526 under the patronage of the emperor's grandson, Archduke Ferdinand. Dürer's small chariot appeared in this procession, which contained several ellipses and omissions. Sometime between the 16th and 18th century, the woodblock for the wagon was lost. To this day, only the block with the Victory, a vigorous driver now unhinged from her cart, survives. By the second edition of 1777 and a third of 1796, the small chariot was represented only by its right half, a winged charioteer holding the quadriga's reins. The absence of the float representing the imperial wedding accentuates the already allegorical status of Victory. It had been the unique contribution of Dürer to the procession as a whole to split the motive force between the winged charioteer and the split-sleeved soldier, balancing a tension between pulling and pushing, female and male, barefoot and shod, classicizing and localizing. But in the surviving states of the pages, the two do not link up. The allegorical figure would survive as available, reusable, transportable to another realm, the independent image of the great triumphal chariot. The wagon shoved by the soldier would become the rarer of the two images, inaccessible, remote, evoked by means of a ghostly appearance. For while the second and third editions of the Triumphal Procession omitted the marriage wagon from the small chariot, by the fourth edition of 1884, organized by Franz Schestag, a photograph from the first edition could serve as a complement to a newly printed sheet bearing Victory's charge. Photography encouraged new modes of image aggregation. On board 57 of his Mnemosyne Atlas, Warburg compiled reproductions to connect Dürer's figures with examples of passionate movement in Italian art. The windswept virtues from the emperor's cart of the allegorical triumph join company with other bodies that lunge and swivel alla antica. Although no explicit reference to Ghirlandaio appears in this particular collage, Dürer's virtues likely reminded Warburg of his nympha. The pose of gravitas is a rotation and slight modification of the fruit-bearing maiden in the Tornabuoni chapel. That Warburg's interest was primarily in this dorsal figure is supported by the proximity of the chariot to the other hind-facing figures, Hercules, the Sabine's rapist, and the Orpheus torturing Maenad. Of less concern to Warburg were the wagon's gently rhythmic horses and their guides. He crops out the equestrian members of the cavalcade, leaving as the only remnant of the chariot's mobilizing force the flying locks of Ratio's hair. You see that right there? The placement of the four horsemen from Dürer's Apocalypse above the emperor's carriage speaks to Warburg's taste for an energetic charge. It is as if, through association with these riders' vim, the allegorical great chariot picks up some of the pace of the small chariot's turbulent quadriga. For Maximilian, horsebacked riders transported messages between collaborators and facilitated the making of pictures. Warburg also associated the post with the carrying of ideas and was especially fascinated with their conveyance by airmail. He conceived of as a design for a stamp in which the underside of an airplane wing is inscribed Idea Vincit, a pronouncement of his association of imaginative thinking with vertical motion. In one of his philatelic image clusters, he gathered examples of stamps that bear the soar, eagles from Mexico, Bolivia, and Bavaria, a skyborne Icarus from Hungary, airplanes from Danzig and Czechoslovakia, and a pilot from Switzerland. The postage stamp could carry messages while conveying motifs from antiquity. An example from Barbados shows the British monarch riding a triumphal cart across the sea. Warburg traced the iconography of the seal of Charles II and to the appropriation of Neptune's imagery in the festival accoutrements of the Bayonne court. His lecture on the stamp demonstrates how the island was linked to the European colony that claimed it through the imposition of an imagery that had a long history of asserting oceanic right of passage. The idea of empire is an effort to bring together in the collective imagination territories that are geographically dispersed by connecting a vision of a common past with a projection of an exultant future. Maximilian had intended for the triumphal procession, which summons allusions to antique rituals of warfare and to actual battles fought, to serve as a gift to adorn the walls belonging to council chambers of cities under his dominion. Imagining multiple recipients for his pictorial programs was one of the ways that Maximilian sought to control a collective vision. But having never served to unify in this manner, the parts of the triumphal procession that have been brought together by later collectors are sometimes patchwork assemblages. one bound copy stitches together sheets printed over 3 campaigns from 1526, 1777, and 1797. Most of the impressions are from the first edition, in which the signs that had been intended for inscription were inked in reminders of the unfulfilled intention for text. To behold this parade of boldly mute banners requires the turning of pages, an experience that interrupts the sense of motion, detaching carts from their charioteers and revealing the seams in the sequence that the intended wall display would have attempted to disguise. In the epistolary relay of its production, in its state of unfinish, in the separability and independence of some of its parts, and in the efforts that historians have made to stitch together chronologically disjointed impressions, the Triumphal Procession might serve as the work of art that best describes how the Holy Roman Empire worked and what its ruler thought it might be. It is in the compensatory moments where what survives starts to act in place of what was lost or never produced, where studies and trials may be given more time to perform than their finished versions ever were granted, that the ambitions and intentions of the dead began to share messages with the living. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shira, very much for an immensely rich lecture, which really unfolded all these orders of mobility and made me certainly see the procession in a completely different light. Thank you. So now the floor is open to questions.
Shira, I have a question about sending and traversing topography, partly because there really is no topography often in processional prints, but this one strikes me as interesting because of the explicit description of place and location in the events illustrated on the vehicles themselves, and the symbolic reference to place by way of particular figures, and yet the stark absence of topography and the representation of moving through space. And I'm wondering if there's a sense that Dürer is underscoring the fact that a procession is almost always already about the topography of the mind, which is sort of pulls it away from the discussion of the concrete, the real versus the fictional and whatnot. I just wanted to see if you had something to say about topography.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think we think about it in terms of the triumphal procession because of this, the nature of the fact that it ends in a landscape and a particularly Germanic landscape. Those last prints that I showed at the beginning, right? Suddenly, suddenly they situate us, whereas we are aware up until that moment how much the language of the triumph is, of course, a borrowed language from antiquity and filtered through many other ways. But what I've found interesting in researching this procession is the way in which, for me, reading the concerns of the emperor and his collaborators, the concerns that are transmitted through letter writing, which has so much to do with being in the right place at the right time, right? The emperor is constantly on the move. He's sending his letters from different places to people, collaborators who are also on the move, right? And the success of this program relies on the exact linking up of those letters, of all those messages being transmitted from the commissioner, the emperor, who is the visionary. You know, he's the one envisioning this, to all the various executors of the project. And the success of the project is also reliant on all of these woodcuts eventually lining up and persuading the sense of procession. And I think what's interesting is how much the very concerns, the very anxieties about those postal transmissions, the anxieties about place, about time, all of those anxieties were were sort of realized in the failure of this project to ever really materialize as the emperor envisioned it. So I see that kind of all of those disruptions in the geography when I look at this. Despite the best efforts, when you see there are awkwardnesses when you actually connect the prints. There are sort of embarrassing moments where things don't come together in the right way.
Can I ask a question about sort of the display function of these? And in sending them, presumably they were sent as loose prints, sort of stacked together, not bound. Were they bound when they were sent?
Well, the question of how they would have been presented, I mean, had they been completed and sent to the various places where the emperor would have wanted them to be displayed, that we will never know because that never happened. But in terms of the correspondence and the actual transmission between collaborators, from what I've read, the letters described that they were rolled up and placed in sort of like tubes made of leather.
Huh. So like documents.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
That's the way documents were
Yeah.
sent. But I'm just wondering, when the images when they're put together, the way they're displayed in museums sometimes, now and then you see groups that are put together. I mean, it really, and then when you showed the one that was in the Rathaus in Nuremberg, which I'd never seen that image before, I mean, there's so much like film.
Yeah.
And the Warburg connection too makes me wonder, is this the beginning of the idea? Because there are things that are moving and then they're being represented over space and through time, in a sense. I mean, it's such a cinematic view.
Yeah, and they are reliant. I mean, if one can imagine the procession, and most scholars think that the procession was intended to lead up to the Triumphal Arch. So that would have been the connection between the Triumphal Arch and the procession. Although as programs, Maximilian sort of treats them differently, and he calls them both triumphs. So that's why the letters, it gets very confusing. But anyway, to your point about cinema, I mean, I think that they are responsive, the images are then responsive to imagining a viewer who is moving, right? It require in order to engage the procession, you yourself have to move. And the problem with seeing these in a bound volume, as one experiences them now, I mean, it's because there's like 55 meters of it, it's pretty hard to see it, exhibited in a museum. So one mostly experiences them either as, disparate prints, like, the Art Institute of Chicago has 8 of them, so there are various collections where you can find a few of them here and there. But otherwise, you're turning these bound pages, and the sequence there is incorrect.
But it's also, I guess, going back to a kind of the form of the scroll,
Mhm.
which predates the book.
Right.
So that's a whole other kind of association with something that's a continuous, that's supposed to be that way. Anyway, I'm just reassociating.
Oh, that's great.
That's
And the connection with Warburg is really nice too. Yeah, Kemi.
Could you just say more about the relationship to Mantegna? You alluded to his triumphs and so forth, but those were also, I think you showed the painting, but there were prints after that.
Right.
And so would those have been known to Durer? Was there direct allusions and so forth? Was there a dialogue?
Yeah, I think they would have been known in the North, and I think what's interesting is that Mantegna, we know that in the 15th and 16th centuries, one question that was on the mind of illustrators and people interested in processions was whether in antiquity, of course, the representations had been, structural and three-dimensional or on these banners, because none of the parade materials survive from that period. And they're alluded to in, I mean, we know about their existence from Josephus talks about them, but there's this question of whether they were banners or floats like this. And Mantegna opts for the banner approach in how he's portraying the parade of battles. So I think there's a kind of direct reflection on that, because the Altarfort images that are in the Albertina also make that decision. And I'm interested in the fact that the battle scenes in the woodcut procession make the other decision. But I do think the Mantegna images would be known. The other interesting note about the Mantegna is just the paintings, the history of those paintings, which are now, of course, in Hampton Court. They've been overpainted and unpainted so many times that the whole reconstruction of those paintings is a very interesting topic. That's, I think, related to this question of how we're processing these images.
I almost don't want to ask you another question.
I'm sorry about my February laryngitis.
I liked your point about the role of illuminators kind of determining the realms of the different elements, whether they're real or not real. And I was wondering what you know about kind of the variation in versions of those. That, you know, are there some where there are certain distinctions made that are more clear than others, or just more about that?
So the ones that there is an illuminated version in Vienna and one also at the university in Graz, which is the one I showed. And what I've noticed is there's no consistency about the decision of color between colored versions, but within there's an interior logic to the illumination, right? And one of the ways in which those figures who are ambiguously sculptural figures or parade members are connected is through costume and the way in which they're illuminated. But I think there were no, to my knowledge, there are no surviving instructions about illumination. So that would have been an independent decision that happened later.
Would you think would create much different effects?
Right.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I don't know much about the history of the post in 16th century Germany, but are you suggesting that the emperor used a regular postal service as opposed to messengers?
So Maximilian did contract what became the Turn and Taxa system in 1490. He established the first postal routes to connect parts of his empire, and then there were successive contracts after that, engaging this family who's from Venice, actually, to mastermind his post. And he makes payments. We have the documents. I lay this out in the chapter that precedes this one in the book. So what I do is I show his establishment of the post, and he is specific in his letters about whether things are going. He calls it post when he wants to use the post, and he calls it boten or bota. He uses the word messenger when it's a foot messenger or somebody who's outside this system. And we can track the movements of those letters because of the payments, the record keeping from these various places. So yes, I am suggesting that he established this system because the idea of efficiency was very important to him, because he was constantly on the move, and he had to, his correspondence was very important to him to have a reliable system. But also this idea of secrecy, the desire to protect these images while they're in production, right? As the breach that we learned about from the Nuremberg Pigs Market is a good example of a breach where one of these images presumably erupted into the public sphere. But yes, I think he was responsible for this highly controlled system by which his letters and images were transmitted.
Chris.
Yeah.
Poor Shira, your voice is fading, and you can write me a letter with your answer. No, I really don't want to tax you, but it was great, and it's a very intricate talk, and many moving parts, and I hesitate to try to add anything or question anything because it was so finely wrought. But am I right in thinking that maybe your key move was the correction of Warburg by replacing the Landsknecht, the Landsknecht with the slit sleeves, the mercenary, for the virtue as the correct comparison to the Ghirlandaio? That is to say that Jolles and Warburg, in their kind of puerile fantasy, fixated on the women and compared the Ghirlandaio to the virtues. That seems the natural formal comparison. But the more interesting comparison, which was implicit and maybe close to explicit in your talk, was between the Ghirlandaio fruit-bearing woman and the Landsknecht who pushes the cart. And they seem to have, I think it's a correction of Warburg, because you might almost be saying that Warburg has a fantasy about the vitalistic, flowing currency of images intervening in the Renaissance and redeeming the pragmatic, materialist, contingent life of the bourgeoisie. That is to say, the Tornabuoni required this, or invited actually this this life force coming from it, from the origins embodied in this woman, and in other words, the redemption of the bourgeoisie. It's important for Warburg. Whereas Dürer seems to be saying something quite different. He seems to be, for him, the contingent and the pragmatic and the creaturely is located in the Landsknecht, the mercenary. He's the one who pushes his, and it's realistic, as you said, pushing the car out of the snowstorm. And it ends up desublimating the monarch, because the opposite of Warburg's ideal pathos formel, which hurdles from the past in this kind of ideal, medial, frictionless form. The opposite of that is Maximilian's pathetic attempts to kind of broadcast his image by these, as you say, relayed, delayed, interrupted, incomplete, ephemeral paper icons, and this kind of ideal of moving his image around. And all of this seems rather flimsy because, unlike Montaigne's triumphs, which are celebrating a victory, there's nothing behind it. Maximilian has nothing but image. He has no money. He has no army. He's nothing, right? And Dürer unmasks that through the mercenary. It's the exact inverse of Warburg.
Yes, and I think what is so interesting to me is what happens is because of the happenstance of the loss of that block, right? The victory survives, but we don't have the cart. In a way, the cart intriguingly becomes the remote thing, and the processions, of course, are the remote things, right? Whereas the image of victory, the allegory, is actually much, it has more currency. It's actually the thing that picks up and gains currency and is popularized. Whereas the cart is the thing that disappears and then reappears only in this ghostly format, right? That it's photographed. So yeah, one of my ambitions, as you've just articulated, is to juxtapose Warburg's thinking, which of course is always, his thinking backward, his moving historically back in time, following these female figures. This activation of his imagination to remote realms, and juxtapose that by asking the question of what happens when we look at correspondences between artists who are working together in a much more localized manner. And it's interesting to me that, the question of either whether it's important to distinguish who made what in this sequence, right? Because these artists are all through the post sharing language, sharing visual vocabulary with each other. The other element that emerges in this comparison between this kind of the mercenary soldier, the local mercenary soldier, and the remote victory has to do with a question of pace or speed. That is to say that Warburg, of course, he likes energetic motion, right? So he crops out things or he wants to juxtapose the idea of an ideal calm with the energetic motion. I think that Dürer is an artist who's interested in slowness. I think he's interested in deceleration. And I think he's interested in producing a kind of decelerated approach to looking at images. And part of what I'm interested in, I guess, as a method, is trying to articulate the moments in his images where we see that kind of deceleration. And I think he triggers his viewer to slow down and look more closely. And I think that trigger for decelerated looking, for decelerated interpretation, comes in the juxtaposing of these things that are near and far. It comes in that friction, in that tension. But on the other hand, the slowness is interesting to think about Dürer as an artist interested in deceleration. It is really intriguing when one reads his correspondences, because when he's writing to a patron or a friend, his notion of how one should value art has to do with how much time he spent on it. That was how he thought about his work, was, of course, as artists do, in units of measurement of time. So that becomes a kind of currency for him in terms of how he's thinking about his
It's
images.
interesting, it's as if Dürer is already remembering the pre-postal, and Warburg's anticipating the post-postal.
Can I take a sort of completely sort of materialist view, in a sense, and just ask what relation these images might have to actual processions, and sort of imperial processions and so forth, from the sense that a contemporary viewer might well expect to see something like this, where the allegorical and the real are anyway combined in real actors. And so that slippage that you speak of, there would be an extra dimension of just recognizing the reality behind that sort of more metaphysical notion of slippage. Is that something?
Yeah, absolutely. And when when I sat down to read the instructions that Maximilian wrote, I thought, okay, let's pretend. Of course, he's not directing a real parade, but if he were, when would you employ actors, and when would you hire your stage your designers, right? So right, at which point are you? So of course, this is a fictive parade, and as Chris mentioned, Maximilian he's the paper prince because he doesn't have money, so he does the woodcut instead of the real parade. But that being said, of course, triumphal parades, whether they were for funerals, weddings, entries, were part of the theater of people's experience. So I think that was something that people would have experienced, and I think those processions would have encouraged that kind of engagement of losing track of the built world and the living figures.
I was also very struck by the literary analogies with the Mackie and so forth, and it reminded me of Ovid's the structure of Metamorphoses. The idea of the story within the story, and the story of the story, which again take away from the notion of literary progress as a linear progress, and constantly take you in different directions. And I just wonder if there's any, is there any evidence of actual concrete correspondences of a Pirkheimer, referencing Ovid or anything like that in the correspondence?
I haven't found a direct reference to the Ovid. Ovid is a great example also, because Ovid is somebody who laments that from the position of exile he can't watch the parade, which of course is a fictive parade. So he's a great interlocutor for this project. But I think what we see here is the fact that to give the emperor a little credit, he was somebody who was so steeped in how epic narrative worked. I think he really understood that, and I think that really comes through in the decoration on these parade floats. That there's some sense in which his desire to be immortalized through the language of epic narrative was something that I think his artists understood about him.
Well, if there are no more questions, it just remains for me to thank you so much for wonderfully
Thank you
enriching
for coming.
lecture. Thank you very much.